Richard Langley was a man whose success was undeniable. At 56 years old, his name was associated with wealth, philanthropy, and social responsibility. He was the kind of person who seemed to have it all: a vast estate in the countryside, positions on the boards of some of the world's most influential companies, and an impeccable reputation. By all appearances, Richard had reached the peak of success. Yet despite all the accolades, a strange emptiness had begun to grow inside him over the years. He was surrounded by luxury, but more and more, he felt disconnected from the world around him. He had always been the type to stay busy, to keep moving forward, to focus on the next project, the next deal, the next charitable initiative. But as he grew older, he started to wonder what it all truly meant. He had never married, never had children, at least none he acknowledged. His relationships were fleeting, often superficial. Richard found solace in his work, immersing himself in the responsibilities that came with his wealth. But no matter how much he achieved, there was always a lingering feeling that something was missing, something important. It was a crisp autumn afternoon in the city when everything changed. Richard had just stepped out of a business meeting at his headquarters and decided to take a walk through the bustling streets. He enjoyed these moments of solitude, even amidst the crowds. They gave him time to think, to reflect on his life and the world around him. As he walked, he noticed a young man sitting on the sidewalk, a worn cardboard sign beside him asking for help. The man was homeless, his clothes ragged, his face bearing the exhaustion of someone who had endured too much hardship in too few years. Yet there was something about him that made Richard stop in his tracks, something he couldn't quite explain. The teenager, no older than 17 or 18, looked up as Richard approached. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. The young man had the same piercing blue eyes as Richard, the same sharp jawline, even the same slight cleft in the chin that Richard had inherited from his father. The resemblance was uncanny. Richard's heart pounded. He stood frozen, staring at the young man. It wasn't just the physical similarity that unsettled him. It was the way the teenager looked at him, with a mix of curiosity and recognition, as if he too sensed an inexplicable connection between them. "Can I help you with something?" the young man asked, his voice uncertain. Richard blinked, snapping out of his daze. I, I'm sorry," he stammered. "I didn't mean to stare." "It's all right," the teenager replied with a small shrug, though his expression remained cautious. "People stare all the time." For reasons he couldn't explain, Richard felt an overwhelming need to learn more about this young man. It was as if fate had placed him in Richard's path, and now that their lives had crossed, he couldn't just walk away. "What's your name?" Richard asked, his voice softening. "Chris," the young man replied. "Chris Johnson." "Chris," Richard repeated, nodding slowly. "How long have you been out here?" Chris shrugged again. "A couple of months, I guess. Been bouncing around, trying to find work, but—" He trailed off, his expression darkening. "It's hard when you're just another black kid with no connections. No one really cares." Richard felt a pang of guilt at his words. He knew the world was full of injustices, full of people who slipped through the cracks. But this felt different. This felt personal. For some reason, this encounter made him feel as though he had failed in some way. "Where's your family?" Richard asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Don't have much of one," Chris said simply. "My mom passed away last year. She was all I had." Richard's heart sank. He wanted to offer some kind of comfort, but the words felt empty in his mouth. What could he say? What could he possibly say to a young man who had faced such hardships? What right did he have to offer sympathy when his own life had been filled with privilege? "Do you have a place to stay tonight?" Richard asked. Chris shook his head. "I'll figure something out. I always do." Richard's mind raced. He couldn't just walk away and leave this young man on the streets. There was a part of him, an undeniable, inexplicable part, that felt responsible for Chris. It was as if some invisible thread connected them, pulling Richard deeper into the boy's life. "Come with me," Richard said suddenly, the words escaping before he could think twice. Chris frowned, his guard immediately going up. "Why?" "I want to help you," Richard said earnestly. "Just for tonight. I have a place nearby where you can clean up, have a meal, get some rest. Then we'll figure out what to do next." Chris hesitated, clearly torn between skepticism and desperation. Richard could see the wheels turning in his mind, weighing the risks and benefits of accepting help from a stranger. Look, I know this is weird, Richard added, sensing his hesitation, but I swear, I just want to help. No strings attached. After what felt like an eternity, Chris finally gave a small nod. All right, he said quietly, but just for tonight. Richard exhaled in relief. He hailed a cab, and the two of them rode in silence to Richard's penthouse. As they stepped inside, Chris's eyes widened at the sheer luxury surrounding him, the marble floors, the towering windows overlooking the city skyline. It was a world completely foreign to him. You live here? Chris asked, his voice tinged with awe. Richard nodded, feeling a pang of guilt at the stark contrast between their lives. Yeah, he admitted. I do. Chris didn't say much more, but Richard could see the thoughts racing through his head. He knew the young man was trying to make sense of why someone like him, someone with so much, would take an interest in a homeless kid. Truthfully, Richard wasn't entirely sure himself. As Chris showered and changed into some of Richard's clothes, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was more than just a coincidence. There was something about Chris that tugged at his soul, something that made him question everything he thought he knew about his own life. The next few days passed in a blur. Richard arranged for Chris to stay at a hotel, gave him some money, and started making calls to help him find a job. But no matter what he did, he couldn't stop thinking about the boy. The resemblance was too strong, too specific to ignore. Richard found himself fixated on the idea that Chris wasn't just a random stranger. There had to be a reason they had crossed paths. Finally, unable to shake the thought, Richard made a decision. He asked Chris if he'd be willing to take a DNA test. Chris looked at him, confused. Why would I do that? He asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. Richard hesitated. I don't know how to explain it, he admitted, his voice tinged with desperation. But I think we might be related. Chris narrowed his eyes. What? Like you think you're my long-lost uncle or something? Richard shook his head. No, he said softly. I think I might be your father. The words hung between them, heavy and impossible. Chris stared at Richard as if he had just spoken complete nonsense. Then after a long moment, he let out a half laugh, half scoff. You're kidding, right? I'm not, Richard said quietly. I know it sounds crazy, but there's something about you, something that feels too familiar. Years ago, before I became the man I am now, I had a brief relationship. I never knew what came of it. But I can't shake the feeling that you might be my son. Chris studied Richard for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then finally he gave a small nod. Fine, he said. I'll take the test. The days that followed were agonizing for Richard. He couldn't focus on anything else. The thought that Chris might actually be his son consumed him. Over and over, he replayed the past in his mind, trying to piece together the timeline, wondering. The idea that he might have a child he never knew about had once seemed impossible, and yet the resemblance was undeniable. When the results finally came back, Richard's heart nearly stopped. The test confirmed what he had suspected all along. Chris was his biological son. Richard sat in stunned silence, staring at the report in his hands. He had a son he had never known, a son who had grown up in poverty, surviving on the streets, while Richard had lived a life of luxury and privilege. The weight of it was crushing. All the success, all the wealth. It meant nothing in the face of this revelation. Richard had failed. He had failed Chris. And he had failed the woman who had raised him alone. He remained in the quiet of his study. The DNA test results spread out before him. The realization hit him harder than he had anticipated. How could this have happened? How had he not known? His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of his past. It had been decades ago, a brief affair with a woman whose face he could barely recall. They were young, their relationship fleeting, ending before either of them had considered what might come of it. At the time it had seemed insignificant, but now, staring at the undeniable proof before him, Richard felt the weight of his past mistakes pressing down on him. His fingers drummed anxiously against the wooden desk, his chest tightening. He had spent years constructing a life of control, stability, and success. But this This was beyond his control. And the worst part was that while he had been building his empire, his son had been struggling to survive. The thought gnawed at him, filling him with guilt. He knew he had to talk to Chris. But how? What could he possibly say to bridge the chasm of lost years? Richard had spent his entire adult life helping others through philanthropy, yet none of it mattered in the face of his own son's suffering. No donation, no charitable foundation could make up for the years Chris had spent without a father. That evening, Richard invited Chris back to his home, determined to have the conversation that had weighed on him since he first suspected the truth. Chris arrived with an unreadable expression, clearly unsure of what to expect. They sat across from each other in the lavish living room, the space between them heavy with tension. "I got the results," Richard said, his voice low, unsteady. "You're my son." Chris didn't flinch. He had been preparing himself for this possibility ever since Richard suggested the test. But hearing it spoken aloud was something else entirely. His jaw tightened, and after a long pause, he gave a small nod. "Yeah," he said. "I figured as much." Richard swallowed hard, struggling to find the right words. "Chris, I didn't know. I swear if I had known." Chris cut him off, his voice calm but sharp. "If you had known what? You would have been there for me. You would have stopped me from living on the streets? From watching my mom work herself to death just so I could eat?" Richard winced. He had imagined this conversation in 100 different ways, but none of them prepared him for the raw, unfiltered truth of what Chris had endured. "I'm sorry," Richard said, barely above a whisper. "I can't change the past, but I want to make things right now. I want to be there for you." Chris leaned back, arms folded across his chest, his gaze unwavering. "Make it right? How? You think money's going to fix this? You think just showing up now erases everything?" Richard shook his head, feeling more powerless than he ever had before. "I don't know what will fix it," he admitted. "I just know that I want to try." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, heavy with years of absence and unspoken pain. Chris stared at the floor, his mind clearly racing through everything he had just learned. Despite his calm exterior, it was clear that the revelation was shaking Chris to his core. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "My mom never told me who my father was," he said. "She always said he wasn't around, and that was all I needed to know. So I didn't care. I didn't need a dad. But then she got sick, and we didn't have enough for the hospital bills. I watched her die, and all I could think about was how, maybe, just maybe, if we had a little more money, she could have survived." The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. "Chris, I can't even begin to tell you how sorry I am. If I had known, if I had been there, things could have been different." Chris looked up, his eyes flashing with a mix of anger and sorrow. "But you weren't there," he said. "You were out living your billionaire life while we were barely getting by." Richard had no defense. Everything Chris said was true, and the weight of it pressed down on him like a crushing tide. "I'm here now," Richard said softly. "I know that doesn't make up for anything, but I want to get to know you. I want to help." Chris let out a long breath, his face finally softening. "I don't need your money," he said. "But maybe we can figure this out. I don't know. I've spent my whole life being angry about a lot of things, but I don't know what to do with this." Richard nodded, a glimmer of hope stirring in his chest. "We don't have to figure it all out right now," he said. "But we can start by spending time together, by getting to know each other." The next few weeks were tentative. Father and son met regularly, slowly building something neither of them knew how to navigate. Chris, still wary of Richard's wealth, made it clear that he didn't want handouts or charity. What he needed was something deeper, understanding, connection. As they spent more time together, Richard learned about the life Chris had lived, the struggles, the resilience, the battles he had fought alone. And in turn, Chris began to see a side of Richard beyond the billionaire in the headlines. He saw a man grappling with his mistakes, trying to reconcile his past with the son he had never known. One day, as they sat together in a quiet park, Chris opened up about his future. "I don't want to stay on the streets forever," he admitted. "I've got dreams, you know? I just never had the opportunity to go after them." Richard looked at him, a mixture of pride and regret filling his chest. "You don't have to do it alone anymore," he said. "Whatever you want to do, I'm here to help." Chris nodded, though a part of him still remained guarded. "I guess I just never thought I'd have someone in my corner like this." Over time, Richard came to understand just how much privilege he had taken for granted. Chris's story was a stark reminder of the disparities between them, not just in wealth but in experience. Richard's success had insulated him from the harsh realities Chris had faced every day, and as they worked to bridge the gap between their worlds, they both learned valuable lessons. For Richard, it was humbling, a reminder that success meant nothing without compassion, without family. For Chris, it was the realization that while life had been unfair, he didn't have to carry the weight of it alone anymore. In the end, Richard did more than just offer financial support. He became the father he had never had the chance to be. And Chris, in turn, found a place in his life where he didn't have to fight every battle on his own. It wasn't a perfect ending. There were still wounds that needed healing, moments of tension and uncertainty. But it was a beginning neither of them had expected, but one they both embraced with open arms. And as they stood together, looking out over the city skyline that had once seemed so distant to Chris, they both understood something. Family wasn't just about blood, it was about the choices they made, moving forward, together.